Good morning. Good to see you all this morning, as usual. And how many people have ever heard a sermon on Hosea chapter 1? Maybe one or two. Yeah, that's what I thought. This is the thing about the Old Testament. There's a lot of stuff going on back then. I mean, why do we need soap operas and reality TV? Just read the Old Testament. So if that's not an endorsement to go read your Bibles, I don't know what more I can do for you. But anyway, I have a preacher's dilemma this morning. And the preacher's dilemma is I've got more time than usual. So the dilemma is, do I preach longer or let people go early? That's the question, isn't it? And so would you like to take a vote about that? We're not going to do that this morning. I'm going to try and settle both. I'm going to try and do a little both this morning. So, but good luck, yeah. Here's what we got. I want to share with you a contract that I have with a company, and I want to share some of the. I started to read. You know those contracts we sign that we don't read all the way through? You know those? You know, especially the software agreement. You know, I love the software agreements. You know, we're going to update your software, but every time they update your software, you've got to read this thing that says, yeah, I accept the terms of this agreement, which I really, to be honest with you, never read. I don't know if you do that, but I don't. I just click, yeah, okay, let's move on. But here's some things that I found in a contract that I signed without even reading it, and here's one of the lines. Please note that we may not always be able to notify you in advance of changes to these charges. Get that? That means that they can change the charges and not let you and I know about it, okay? Next line is, we can, without notice, limit, suspend, or end your service or any agreement with you for any good cause, including, but not limited to, which means anything, right? It's a loophole. It's a clause in that contract. Next part I kept reading and said, you agree we aren't responsible for problems caused by you or others or by any act of God. I love that line. It's like we can get out of just about anything, right? And just blame God for it. So, and then the last one is, you cannot assign this agreement or any of your rights or duties under it without our permission. However, we may assign this agreement or any debt you owe us without notifying you. Not just without our permission, but without even letting us know. Can change it. Now, where do you think I pulled these clauses from? Apple software. Yeah, every time you got to do that update, it's like, except. I would tell you that most of you have signed this contract in this room. Cell phone contract. So, all you young people whose parents have signed this contract for you that have cell phones, just this is the risk that we're taking for your texting. But this is what's going on. And so we sign these contracts, and how does that make you feel, knowing that this customer relationship that you and I have really protects the company? These clauses protect the company, but don't protect us. How does that make you feel? Not too good, does it? This is what's called a loophole. You know where we originally got the concept of a loophole? It's actually from a castle. Let's take a look at this. This is a loophole in a castle. This is created in the wall of a castle so that an archer could take his or her bow and take it and point it out that castle wall and shoot people. That's why it's called a loophole. A loophole is a hole in a wall that you can fire out of, that you can shoot a weapon out of. What it's basically saying is that I can shoot you, but you can't shoot me, right? I can do something to you, but you can't do the same back to me. That's called a loophole. That's what that contract was. There are loopholes in the contract. And so that's the thing about contracts. If not only is it if I break part of the contract and the other person can get out of the contract, but some of these loopholes I can't even get out of the contract, but they can get out of the contract. And there's something that just feels wrong about that, doesn't it? There's just something that says, I want to have a relationship with this company that's going to be reliable, that's going to be dependable, that's going to be faithful to what they've agreed to do. And there comes Hosea. Because God feels the same way that you and I do about our contracts. God feels the same way about God's people as you do. God wants reliability. God desires dependability. God desires faithfulness from God's people. And along comes Hosea and says, you know what? The people of Israel, and this is the northern kingdom at this time in Israel's history. There were two kingdoms, northern, southern, Israel, and Judah. And she's saying to the kingdom of Israel, saying, you all have not been faithful to God. You have gone and done your own thing. And you have neglected your faithfulness to God. And so God says to the prophet, this minor prophet, Hosea, and prophets did some really crazy things in the Old Testament. You can read some of the things that Jeremiah did and the crazy things that happened. But here God says, I want you to go marry a prostitute. Basically is what Hosea does. You know, first of all, let me put this disclaimer. I have not married a woman of ill repute. I have a wonderful wife. But can you imagine, well, how would you react if your pastor went and married a woman that you knew was a prostitute? I mean, that wouldn't sit real well in the church, would it? But then yet, here is God's prophet going and doing this action. Because the prophet is trying to communicate God's judgment against Israel. And the judgment is, just as I am marrying this woman who has been unfaithful, so Israel, you have been unfaithful to God. You have, in a sense, prostituted yourself in your relationship to God. Those are pretty harsh words, aren't they? And that's the thing about prophets. They're usually pretty harsh and pretty direct. But there is a good message in here. It's interesting because Hosea puts this into perspective and puts this into a marriage relationship, okay? Saying that God has a relationship with God's people, not just a contract with God's people. A relationship with God's people. A couple things were going on back in Hosea's day. One was that this is actually a prophecy that comes at a time of peace and prosperity in the land. And people have been getting more and more wealthy, and as with their wealth came more and more luxury. But at the same time that the wealth was increasing and the luxury was increasing, guess also what else was increasing around them? Poverty. The poor. I don't know if that relates to us today or not. But I did read a statistic this week that 20% of children in America are now living in poverty, and this is an 18% increase over what it was 10 years ago. So in the past 10 years, we have more young children living in impoverished home or below the poverty line in America than we've ever had previously. So maybe we're getting wealthy at the expense of someone else. We don't know. There's a whole lot of political arguments out there. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about it over the next year. The other thing that was happening was that the people of Israel were using their wealth to buy justice, to work the system, to buy people off, and that things were not even and fair in the system. And I think about that, and I remember another statistic I read this week, that 83 out of the top 100 companies traded on the stock market have offshore tax shelters. So that means they can move their money, their profits, off into this other company outside the United States, so that they don't have to pay taxes on that money. 83 out of 100 of the top companies have those shelters, and it's legal to do that. I mean, it's part of the tax law. It's a loophole in the tax law that allows that to happen. So have we taken advantage of the system? Have we used our wealth to take advantage of the system? Possibly. But the main thing that's going on in Hosea's day is that people had turned away from worshiping God, and they had turned to all these other fads and all these other idols and all these other distractions. And guess what they were worshiping? They were worshiping a golden calf again. And if you remember your Exodus story from Sunday school, Moses is up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments from God, and the people are having a party around a golden calf. And here we see this golden calf come back again in Hosea's day. People are worshiping these other idols. They're distracted by these other gods, and they're living and chasing after these things for meaning and purpose in their lives that really aren't fulfilling. They're just things made by human hands. And so Hosea comes into this context and gives this prophecy of unfaithfulness. Because God desires a relationship with God's people, not a religious contract with God's people. Let me explain that a little bit more. You know, I think it's easy to be religious. Because in my religion, I can say, well, if I do A, B, and C religiously, then I can do whatever I want with the rest of my life or with the rest of my being, right? So as long as I do these three things, and I'm religious about those three things, I can go do whatever I want with the rest of my life. So I've lived up to my religious obligations. Let's say that on our anniversary, I did the obligatory thing with my wife. I went and bought a Hallmark card and said, "Happy anniversary." And that was it. I met my obligation. I said, "Happy anniversary," right? I did what I was supposed to do. I went to Hallmark and bought a Hallmark card, right? And I said, "Happy anniversary." Is that what my wife wants from me? Just an obligation? Or does my wife want a relationship? Does my wife want my time? Does my wife want my attention? Does my wife want my devotion? That's relationship. My wife doesn't want to feel obligated to. My wife wants to know that I'm devoted to her. It's the same with God. God doesn't want religious obligation. God wants devotion, relationship from us, faithfulness from us. I was driving through town one day, coming home from church, not this town, another town, and behind this guy in a pickup truck, and we're driving through town. We're going along at a good clip. Yeah, we're making good time. No traffic, no problems, no lights, no stop signs. And all of a sudden, he puts on the brakes in the middle of the road. There's no kids coming across, no animals running across. He just stops in the middle of the road. And I'm like, dude, what are you doing? There's no stop sign, no stop. Why are you stopping? And there's no reason for you to stop. And just as I'm about to lay on the horn, and get him moving, I see him look over to his left, and up on the hill to the left is a Catholic church. And I can see him do this. And then he grabs the steering wheel again, and he hits the gas and takes off again. And I thought, this is my interpretation of what happened. He didn't make it to church that morning. But he felt obligated to at least show some respect, right? He had missed it. He had been too busy. He had been doing something else, so he didn't go to church. And so he said, well, I'll at least, I'll do that. I think he figured it out. Well, I'll just stop by the church on my way to this, and I'll, pay my respects, and I'll keep going. Because he's working out of a place of obligation, out of religious obligation, rather than out of relationship to God. That's different. And so that was my interpretation of that. But see, God desires a relationship with us. And that's why God puts this message in the context of a marriage. In fact, that's what happens in the New Testament too. Christ and the church, bride of Christ, bridegroom, is in the context of the New Testament as well. So that's the point that Hosea is trying to make. But then Hosea, not only, can you imagine being Hosea's kids? I mean, you're talking about names that you can pick on in school. One was named Jezreel, which would have reminded everybody of a massacre that occurred earlier in one of the reigns of King Jehu in the northern part of Israel. I mean, can you imagine being named after a massacre? That's the first child. Next child is called Lo Ruhama, which means not loved. Can you imagine going around with your name being not loved, not compassion, not pitied? That's what Lo Ruhama means. And then the last one was named Lo Ami, which meant not my people. You don't belong to me. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine going through life with those names, carrying those names with you? And that was the judgment, that was the punishment that God was proclaiming through the prophet to the people of Israel because they had been unfaithful. It was what God was basically saying was God was saying, I am going to withdraw my favor and my presence from you. The best way I can illustrate that in my mind is if you've ever been a parent or aunt or uncle or friend and ever tried to teach a kid to ride a bike. Have you ever tried to teach a kid to ride a bike? You ever had that experience? And I've had that experience, and typically what happens, you get the helmet on, and you get all the pads on and everything, and you take the training wheels off, and you get out there on the flat, smooth surface, and where is usually the person helping learn? Where am I? I'm in the behind, I'm holding on to the seat, right? And they're wobbling, and I'm trying to hold them steady, and I'm saying, I'm right here, just keep going. But eventually, it's not working out, right? Eventually, they're not getting it. So who gets blamed for it not happening right? It's got to be the guy holding the seat, right? It's got to be the guy holding the seat. So the person on the bike says, I don't need your help. I can do it myself. And then eventually the parent goes, okay, Let's see how this goes, right? Sometimes natural consequences are a good thing, right? So we go along again, and all of a sudden, okay, I'll let go. And I withdraw. And the bike wobbles, falls over, knees are skinned, tears are shed, and they come running back to the person who's helping them. I think in the same way, God is saying to Israel, you want to do it your way, Israel? You want to do it your way, God's people? Okay, I'm going to let go of the seat. And I'm going to let you experience the consequences of your waywardness, of your unfaithfulness. And actually, in Hosea's lifetime, the Assyrians come in and they conquer the Israelites and take them into captivity. The prophet had warned them that this was going to happen, and other prophets actually warned them. Amos and others warned them that this was going to happen, but they kept just going on their own way. And so what was happening is God was withdrawing presence and favor from the people of Israel and saying, okay, I'm going to let go now. Because you've said to God, people, you've said you don't need me. You want to do it your way. And so God withdraws. See, God is not a God who forces God's self on us. We get a lot of freedom in this life. And that's part of God's honoring of who we are and who God is. But the thing is about all the prophets and all the Old Testament is there always is a message of hope. It's not like God ever leaves us forever. It's not like God ever really gives up on us. If you read through, there's always this message of grace and hope and restoration. And if you read and heard, if you look in your bulletins again, look at that last verse in chapter 2, verse 1. What does God speak to them? What does God do? What does God do here in chapter 2, verse 1? God says, say to your brother, Ami, change your brother's name. Change the name to Ami, which means you are my people. Say to your sister, Ruhama, change the name to you are loved. You are favored by God. Now, if you were those kids, right, you'd be like, thank you for changing my name. But that's that sign, that's that message of hope and restoration, that God is saying, you will be my people. I want you to be my people. You are loved. That will never change. You will always be loved. You see, the point is, I think in the whole story of this prophet, is that God is always going to be faithful to us, even when we're not faithful to God. It doesn't matter. God's faithfulness is not dictated by my unfaithfulness or my faithfulness. That's who God is. That's God's character, to be faithful, to stay steadfast. And it's interesting that God puts this in this context of a marriage. And one of the things that I have learned about marriage is actually from Dr. Norman Wright. He defines marriage this way. Dr. Norman Wright defines it and says, marriage is an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person. You got that? An unconditional commitment to an imperfect person. And really, marriage is a covenant. It's not a contract. God's relationship to us is a covenant. It's not a contract. The difference between a contract and a covenant is this. In a contract, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, you don't have to hold up your end of the bargain. If I break part of the contract, that gets you out of the contract. That's contractual. Covenantal says this: if you break your part of the covenant or the contract, I'm still bound to keep mine. Even if you're unfaithful, I'm committed to staying faithful. Even if you break something that you've agreed to do, I'm not going to change who I am, or am I going to break who I am because you've done that? That's covenant. That's different. And what's reflected in it is God. That's God's covenant towards us. God is covenantal, not contractual. And God wants that type of relationship with us. In fact, God's the only person I know that can do that. We're going to be sorely disappointed if we sign contracts with Verizon or other companies, or sometimes even people will disappoint us. But God will not disappoint us. The best way to illustrate that is really with this story that I want to share with you before we close. And that's about a young Filipino woman who grew up on a farm. And her dad was a farmer, agricultural family, grew up in the country. And she would occasionally get magazines at the local store, of all the glamour and glitz of the big city. And she, as she was growing up, always wanted to go to the big city. And her parents were always like, "You're not going to the big city. We know what's going to happen in the big city." But sure enough, she kept wanting to go and wanting to go and wanting to go. And as she got older and as she grew older and as she became more independent and as she grew into a young woman, she said, "You know what? I don't care what my parents are telling me anymore." So one night she packed her bags and she slipped out in the middle of the night without telling her parents, and she went off to the big city. Some time went on. Her parents assumed that she had gone to the city, so her dad went to track her down and went to find her because he knew what would happen if she went to the city. And sure enough, what had happened was she didn't have any means to provide for herself. She didn't have any way of taking care of herself or finding a place to live, and so she found herself easily falling into that particular city, into a life of prostitution, which happens all around the world sometimes, some other places. And so she finds herself in this lifestyle. Her dad comes to the city looking for her, and he's got a picture of her with him, and he's going to every place that he can find, and he's going up to people, and he's showing her a picture, and he says, "Have you seen my daughter? I need to find my daughter." And he searched, and he searched, and he searched, and he could not find her. And what he discovered was he had to go back to the farm because his farm was now the rest of his family is starting to suffer because he's been away, and so he needs to go back. And so he gives up his search and he goes back to take care of his farm, and he prays for his daughter and hopes for his daughter. What he had done when he left, though, is he had made copies of the picture when he was in the city, and everywhere he went, he left a picture of his daughter. And then several months later, there was a knock on the door. And he opened the door, and there stood his daughter with the picture in her hand. And it wasn't the picture that she found that got her to come home. It was what her dad had written on the other side of that picture. And on the back of that picture was written these words: "I don't care what you've done or where you've been, just come home." And that's why she came home. She came home because of her father's faithfulness to her. She came home because she was unconditionally loved when she had experienced a world of conditional love. And there is only one person that I know of that can ever love us the way that we need to be loved, and that's God. God says to us, just come